blind date disaster? The mechanic walked in. The paralyzed female CEO never expected to smile again. Imagine this. You're sitting in a five-star restaurant. The lights are dim. The chandeliers sparkle like tiny frozen stars. The smell of freshly baked bread and expensive wine swirls through the air, and every table around you is filled with laughter. Clinking glasses and couples leaning in close, whispering secrets they don't want the world to hear. But you're not laughing, you're not leaning in. You're not even sure why you're here. And that's exactly where this story begins. Because tonight, a paralyzed female CEO named Clara Winton, one of the youngest billionaires in America, a woman who once ran boardrooms with an iron fist and a smile that made Wall Street tremble, found herself on what was supposed to be a blind date that her best friend set up, but instead turned into something she never could have imagined. And before we go further, hit that subscribe button right now because trust me, you don't want to miss the way this story twists, turns, and changes everything you think you know about love, power, and fate. Clara wasn't just any CEO. She was the definition of power wrapped in silk and steel. But life had not been kind to her recently, because just a year ago, an accident had taken her ability to walk, a crash so brutal that her chauffeur died instantly. Her legs were crushed, and though doctors fought for months, Clara's body never fully recovered. She returned to work in a wheelchair, projecting confidence, hiding her scars behind designer suits and carefully rehearsed speeches, but deep down, she carried a loneliness so deep that even her empire of billions could not fill it. And that's why, when her childhood friend Rachel begged her to try a blind date, she reluctantly agreed, not knowing this decision would rewrite the entire script of her life. Sitting in that restaurant, Clara stared at the empty seat across from her, tapping her manicured nails against the table, her mind whispering doubts like poison. What if he doesn't show? What if he pities me? What if he can't look past the wheelchair? And then, just as the waiter poured her a glass of water, the door opened and in walked a man who clearly did not belong in this glittering world of tailored suits and designer dresses. He wore a simple leather jacket stained with oil. His jeans were rugged, his hands rough, and his boots tracked a little dust across the glossy marble floor. A mechanic, lost in a palace. The maitre d' rushed toward him, ready to turn him away, but the man held up a small slip of paper and said, "I'm here for Clara." Every head turned. Whispers filled the room, and Clara's heart, for the first time in months, skipped a beat. Because this wasn't who she was expecting. Rachel had promised a polished lawyer, a dashing tech executive maybe, someone who could match her level, but instead, fate had sent her a stranger who looked like he'd just climbed out from under a car. His name was Ethan Cole, and though Clara didn't know it yet, he carried secrets that would shatter her doubts and force her to smile again, even when she swore she never would. Ethan walked toward her with a confidence that didn't fit his rough edges, his eyes a stormy blue that seemed to notice everything, even the way she straightened her shoulders to hide her weakness. He didn't apologize for being late, didn't stumble over excuses. He simply sat down, met her gaze, and said, "I hope you weren't waiting too long." Clara blinked, taken aback, because there was no pity in his tone, no hesitation in his stare. He looked at her as if the wheelchair didn't even exist, as if she were just a woman on a date, and that unsettled her more than the cruelest stares she had ever endured. She thought about cutting the date short, retreating into the safety of her mansion, but something about Ethan, the way he seemed grounded, unshaken by the polished world around him, tugged at her curiosity. Over appetizers, he asked her about her favorite books, not her company. About the last movie that made her cry, not her quarterly earnings. Clara, used to men who only wanted her money or her connections, found herself laughing softly, almost forgetting that she had promised herself she'd never let her heart get tricked again. But then, just when the evening seemed bearable, the first twist arrived. Across the room, a rival CEO named Victor Kane, a man who had tried to buy out Clara's company months ago, spotted her, and with a smirk, he strutted over, pretending politeness but dripping malice. "Clara," Victor drawled, glancing at Ethan with disdain. "I didn't realize you had traded down." The restaurant chuckled. Clara's stomach twisted with humiliation. But before she could respond, Ethan leaned back, wiped his mouth with his napkin, and said in a voice calm as steel, "Funny, I didn't realize we were letting clowns in tonight. Do you always dress like you raided your grandfather's closet, or is that just for special occasions?" The laughter turned. Victor's face burned crimson. Clara blinked in shock. No one, not even board members, ever stood up to Victor. For the first time in months, Clara felt heat rush to her cheeks, not from shame, but from the spark of something she thought she'd lost. Joy. The night went on, filled with sharp words, unexpected stories from Ethan about rebuilding old cars and raising his younger sister alone after their parents died. And beneath his rugged surface, Clara began to see a man who wasn't defined by status or wealth, but by resilience, loyalty, and honesty, things she hadn't seen in her world of contracts and power plays. Yet even as she smiled, danger brewed in the background. Because Victor wasn't a man who forgot humiliation easily, and Clara, though she didn't know it, had just invited Ethan into a storm that would test both of them in ways neither could imagine. The next morning, Clara woke up in her penthouse suite, the city skyline stretching wide beyond her glass windows, the echoes of last night replaying in her mind like a song she couldn't shut off, the way Ethan had faced Victor without flinching, the rare sound of her own laughter spilling out after months of silence, and the unsettling truth that a part of her wanted to see him again. But CEOs didn't chase mechanics, that's what she told herself. Even as her hand hovered over her phone, tempted to text him until the universe decided for her. Because Rachel burst into her office later that day, grinning like a child who had pulled off the ultimate prank, waving her phone and shouting, "So, how was the blind date? Don't tell me you hated him, because I heard from the maitre d' that the whole restaurant is still buzzing about the showdown with Victor." Clara tried to brush it off, hiding behind her usual armor of cold efficiency, but Rachel saw through her. And before long, Clara admitted reluctantly that she hadn't hated it. In fact, she couldn't stop thinking about Ethan's eyes, his voice, the way he treated her, as if she wasn't broken. Meanwhile, Ethan's morning looked very different. Instead of polished glass towers, he stood in his cramped garage on the edge of town. Grease smeared across his hands as he tightened the bolts on an old Chevy, trying to shake Clara out of his mind, reminding himself she was out of his league. A billionaire who lived in a world where men wore Armani. Not oil-stained jackets, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't ignore the spark he felt, the way she had listened to him, like his words mattered. And then fate struck again, because just as Ethan was closing the garage, a sleek black car pulled up, and out stepped men in tailored suits, Victor Kane's men, carrying a warning wrapped in arrogance. "Stay away from Clara Winton," one sneered, slamming Ethan against the hood of his own car. "She's not for you. She belongs in a different world, and you'd do well to remember it." Ethan's jaw clenched, fists tight, but he didn't fight back. Not yet. Instead, he stared at the man with that same steel Clara had seen in the restaurant and said, "Tell your boss he doesn't own her." They left him bruised but unbroken. And Ethan realized something. This wasn't just about a date anymore. He had stepped into a war he didn't even know existed. Across town, Clara's empire was under fire too. Rumors began spreading in financial papers that her company was unstable. Whispers Victor himself was seeding to weaken her. Investors panicked. Board members whispered about replacing her. And for the first time, Clara felt her chair, both the wheelchair beneath her and the executive one in the boardroom, wobble. That night, exhausted and vulnerable, she did something she never thought she would. She drove herself, with her private driver's help, to Ethan's garage. When he saw her rolling in, framed by the dull light of flickering bulbs and the smell of gasoline, he froze, then wiped his hands nervously on a rag. "Clara?" he asked, disbelief in his voice. And in that moment, titles fell away. She wasn't the CEO, and he wasn't the mechanic. She was just a woman looking for refuge, and he was a man willing to give it. They talked for hours, surrounded by half-fixed cars and scattered tools, sharing stories they had never told anyone else. Clara spoke of the night of her accident, the helplessness, the way she had stared at hospital ceilings and wondered if she'd ever matter again. Ethan revealed the truth about his sister, how he had given up college dreams to raise her after their parents' sudden death, and how every day he worked with his hands so she could have the future he lost. Something broke open between them that night, something raw and real, and when Clara laughed through her tears, Ethan leaned closer without thinking, but then pulled back, afraid of crossing a line. Clara, however, surprised them both by whispering, "Don't you dare stop." For the first time in years, her heart raced not from fear or pain, but from the dangerous thrill of hope. But just as their lips met, a crash outside shattered the moment. Victor's men again, this time setting fire to one of Ethan's cars as a warning. The flames roared, the sirens screamed, and Clara realized she wasn't just falling for Ethan, she was dragging him into her war. Later, back in her penthouse, Clara stared at her reflection in the mirror. Torn between two worlds, the empire she had built, fragile and under attack, and the man who made her feel alive, but who was being targeted because of her. Meanwhile, Victor plotted his next move. His plan wasn't just to ruin Clara's company, it was to humiliate her publicly, to prove to the world that the great Clara Winton was nothing without her legs, nothing without her wealth, and nothing without men like him who could crush her. Ethan, however, had no intention of backing down. Bruised, threatened, and warned, he still showed up at Clara's office the next day with coffee, walking past stunned assistants and board members who stared at the rough mechanic, daring to stand in the skyscraper's polished halls. Clara tried to push him away, telling him this was dangerous, telling him he didn't belong in her war, but Ethan simply leaned down, looked her in the eye, and said, "Maybe I don't belong in your world, Clara, but you belong in mine, where people fight for what matters, and I'm not letting you face this alone." For the first time, Clara believed she didn't have to, yet as she leaned on him, Victor tightened his trap, arranging a board coup that would strip Clara of her power within weeks, unless she made a choice, abandon Ethan to save her company, or fight for love and risk losing everything she had built. She didn't know it yet, but her decision would come at a gala that would change everything, where her enemies planned to destroy her publicly, and where Ethan would prove that even a mechanic could stand taller than a billionaire when it mattered most. The night of the gala arrived like a storm waiting to break, the city's elite gathering beneath glittering chandeliers, cameras flashing, reporters whispering about whether Clara Winton, the once unshakable CEO now rumored to be losing her grip, would even show her face. But she did, rolling in with her head held high, wearing a gown of deep sapphire silk that shimmered with each movement of her chair, her presence commanding silence the way only she could, except tonight. Something was different because beside her, in a borrowed tuxedo that still smelled faintly of motor oil, walked Ethan Cole, his hand steady on her chair, as if daring anyone to challenge their right to be there together. And challenge they did, for Victor Kane was already waiting, a predatory smile carved across his face as he prepared to unveil his coup. The board members, swayed by whispers of instability, had agreed to vote Clara out at midnight, but Victor wanted more than her position. He wanted her humiliation, and so he stepped to the podium during the charity auction, calling attention to Clara with words dipped in venom, saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight you see the truth, a woman who hides weakness behind wealth, who clings to relevance while her company collapses, and who has chosen to embarrass us all by bringing—" His eyes flicked to Ethan with a sneer, "a grease-stained mechanic into our world." The crowd tittered. Reporters' pens scratched, and for a heartbeat, Clara felt that familiar sting of shame, the same sting she had carried since the accident. But then Ethan stepped forward, voice clear and strong, cutting through the murmurs. "Funny thing about grease, Victor," he said, his words rolling out like thunder, "it washes off, But arrogance, that sticks forever. Gasps echoed, cameras turned, and for the first time the laughter wasn't at Clara, it was at Victor. But Victor wasn't done, because with a flick of his hand, he revealed his masterstroke. Documents projected onto a giant screen, showing forged numbers and false emails that painted Clara as incompetent, reckless, even corrupt, evidence the board had been waiting for to cast their final vote. Clara's chest tightened, the room spinning, the trap closing, until Ethan, pulling from a secret he had guarded, stepped to the mic again and revealed what no one expected. "Those emails are fake. I know, because I saw the real ones, the ones Victor deleted when he hacked Clara's server. He didn't count on the fact that I rebuilt that server for her team last week. Every trace of his fingerprints is still there, and if you check the backup I saved, you'll see who the real fraud is." Silence slammed the room. Board members shifted nervously. Reporters exploded with questions. Victor's mask cracked, fury spilling through as he shouted denials. But already, Ethan was handing over a flash drive to Clara's loyal assistant, who rushed it to the authorities waiting outside. And within minutes, federal agents entered, placing Victor under arrest in front of the entire glittering crowd. The humiliation was his, not hers. The board, shocked and scrambling, had no choice but to back Clara publicly, declaring her leadership intact, stronger than ever. And in that moment, Clara felt something she hadn't in so long, triumph not just in business, but in her soul. She turned her chair toward Ethan, her eyes glistening, and whispered, "You saved me." But Ethan shook his head, kneeling slightly so his eyes met hers, and said, "No, Clara, you saved yourself. I just refuse to let you forget who you are." The crowd applauded, flashes blinded, but in that bubble of noise, it felt like only the two of them existed. Later that night, away from the chaos, Clara and Ethan stood on the balcony overlooking the city, the cool air wrapping around them. And she admitted the fear that had haunted her since the accident, that she would never be more than her wheelchair, that no man would ever see her as whole again. And Ethan, without hesitation, cupped her hand and said, "Clara, you are the strongest person I've ever met. You don't need to stand to tower over this world. You already do." Tears broke free, but they were not tears of despair. They were tears of release, of healing. She leaned into him, and this time, when their lips met, there was no interruption, no fire, no laughter, only silence, and the sound of two broken lives beginning to fuse into something unbreakable. Weeks turned to months, and while challenges still came, whispers from society, obstacles at work, long nights fixing cars side by side at Ethan's garage, Clara found herself smiling more than she ever thought possible. Not the forced smiles of boardrooms, but the kind that lit her eyes and softened the scars she thought would never fade. And for Ethan, who had spent so long carrying burdens alone, Clara became not just love, but a partner who understood sacrifice, who saw his worth beyond oil stains and calloused hands. Together, they built something neither billions nor engines could buy, a life stitched from laughter, respect, and resilience. And though the world continued to watch, to judge, to whisper, Clara and Ethan learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to silence the world. It's to smile anyway, because you've finally found someone who sees you as more than what you've lost. So if you've been listening, if you've felt the weight of loneliness or doubt pressing on your chest, remember Clara's story, and don't forget to hit subscribe. Because stories like this remind us that love shows up in the most unexpected ways. Sometimes in the form of a mechanic walking into a restaurant where he doesn't belong, only to prove that he belonged in her heart all along.